Finishing a crochet project can be a roller coaster of emotions. There's the excitement that you're done with the project, followed by the dread of needing to weave in the tail ends. At least that's my experience anyways. I'm one of those crocheters who does not look forward to weaving in the tail ends. But seeing as it's something that must be done to truly finish a project, I thought I would share with y'all some of the methods that I use to weave in ends, along with some tips, tricks, and pointers to make it a smoother process. Before we start weaving in the tail ends of yarn, the first thing we need to do is assess the project. This will let us know what direction we need to go when weaving in the ends. A first question we might ask is, can I just tuck the tail ends to the inside of the project? Amigurumis are a great example of this. We will never see the interior of the project, so instead of worrying about weaving my tail ends into the crochet fabric itself, with amigurumi I can just tuck it inside my creation. This can also be an option for other projects like baskets. For me personally, I don't really care if my basket has tail ends tucked to the inside when I'm done. You can see some tail ends sticking out here, and since this is just a basket and it's on the inside and it's for personal use, that's good enough for me. Another thing to assess, which this tends to be more helpful to address before you start the project, is can I minimize the amount of tail ends that I will need to weave in? For instance, let's say I want a lot of color. I can opt for a variegated yarn that will give color changes for me instead of needing to cut and redraw my yarn constantly throughout the project. Another way to minimize the amount of yarn tails that you will have at the end of your project to weave in is there's a hack to get rid of the yarn tail from the beginning of your project. I'll link to a video that shows that process if you want to check it out. So that's a way to have less tail ends at the end of the project. The last thing to consider when minimizing your tail ends is if you must absolutely change color, assess if it's a project where you can tie knots where the ends just get trimmed. For instance, with this baby blanket, I was doing a lot of color changes because it's a bit of a scrap stash buster. One, I didn't want to deal with all the tail ends from each color change, and two, I didn't want to have a lot of tail ends that could come loose since this is a baby blanket. You can opt for something like the magic knot, which I will link to a video for that, or there's another knot I recently showed in a video. I'll link to that knot as well, and that's what I used for this project. The third thing to assess before we ever start dealing with the tail ends is what your project is going to be put through. Here's what I mean by that. Since it's a garment, I'll want to wash it, and I will be throwing this into the washing machine. That can be a little bit rough on the projects, and obviously I don't want to wear a piece of clothing where I've got tail ends sticking out all over, so that tells me I'll need to be extra secure when weaving in these tail ends. Going back to the baby blanket, this is another example of a project where we probably want those tail ends to be dealt with really securely because we don't want anything coming undone. If you're making an amigurumi project for a young child, same thing, you want those tail ends secure, you don't want anything coming loose. However, there are other projects where frankly those tail ends don't need to be in that secure. This basket is one such example. I could very easily tuck my finger under here and undo these tail ends, but the reality is I'm putting yarn in here, nothing's gonna catch it. I don't need these to be super secure. So for this project, I don't need to secure the tail ends very tightly. I can do more of a good enough method. Now that we've assessed the project and have a good idea on how to deal with our ends, let's take a look at some of the methods we can use. And these methods are going to build upon each other a little bit. Our first option is to crochet over the tail ends when we change color. I used that method when I crocheted my Bug Blitz racing game, hoping to get the pattern for this out very soon. With this method, once I've changed my yarn, I'm going to take the tails left over from the yarn and lay them across the top of my project so that way when I work in these stitches, I'm also working over the tail ends. So let's say I'm doing a row of single crochet. I'll have them draped over the tops of my stitches, so as I work along, it'll get worked over those tails. So when we first insert our hook and pull up a loop, the working yarn is going to go over the tails right there, pull up my loop, and then when I do my yarn over to finish up the stitch, the working end will go over those yarn tails again, and it's going to hide it in there very nicely. This first method is a go-to strategy for me. Whenever I have tail ends that I can crochet around, I will do that. However, I typically don't stop there, which leads me to our second method, and that is to triple overlap the strands. Let me show you with a different project. I have this project here, and this tail is from where I sewed it together. I want to weave this in. To work the triple weave method, it's going to be exactly what it sounds like. I'm going to weave this one thread over itself 3 times. I'll go that way, then this way, then that way, all in the same spot. I'm going to weave it through just down from the stitching. So I will take my needle and punch it on through this fabric. Like so. So that is one. Now this is also a great time for me to mention my first tip when it comes to dealing with crochet ends. It applies for this method, but you can also use it for the other methods I'm showing. And that is, once you weave a tail end through, sometimes your project can get bunchy if we pull it too tight. So my first tip when weaving in ends is, after you thread your tail end through, gently stretch your project back out to the size it needs to be. Now going back to the tripling up method, I've come through once in this direction. Now I'm going to go through the exact same section in the opposite direction. I won't insert my hook in the exact same spot. I'm going to kind of loop over another thread, because if I go in the exact same spot, I might just undo my stitching. So instead, I'll kind of loop over that strand and punch through, following roughly the same path I took the first time. Once I'm threaded through, I will pull my yarn through. Once more, if I pull too tight, it's going to get bunchy. So once I thread it through there, I will grab the base right where I wove through. You don't want to overstretch it, but just stretch it back to the size that your project needs to be. Then to finish up the tripling up method, we're going to go one more time in the opposite direction. And while I do this one, I'm also going to show you our second tip for weaving in ends. And that is, we want to split the yarn when we are sewing. Yarn is made out of multiple ply. And if I run my needle through the strand of yarn, I can separate the ply. This is called splitting the yarn. When I weave my tail end through, I want to do that as much as possible. So I'll go back in through here. You can kind of do a little bit of like a swirling motion as you're going through. But let's say this strand right here, splitting the yarn. The reason for this is, the more we interweave and interlock all of these strands and different ply, the more secure the tail end is going to be. Since this is a garment that I will be throwing in the washing machine, I absolutely want this to be secure, because I don't ever want to have to deal with these tail ends again. So that's tip number 2. Now I can finish up the triple weave method by pulling it through a third time. Again, I'll give it just a nice little stretch to make sure it's sitting in there really well. I'll cut my yarn tail nice and close, and that end is woven in. The tripling up method is great because it's so secure, but one downside is, because we're taking this strand of yarn and running it through the same spot 3 times, some projects it will make it a little bit thick there. For example, on this Bug Blitz racing game, this section here is where I wove in the end 3 times, so going 1, 2, 3. Over here I did not. You can kind of see how this creates a little bit of a ridge. With this project, it's very subtle because the yarn is thin, and for most projects, I am totally okay with getting a little bit of a bump if it means my tails stay in place really well. But maybe that's a look you don't care for, or your project's very delicate and you don't want to give it extra thickness. The great thing about crochet is we can all have different preferences and use whatever method works best for each of us as individuals. And that takes us perfectly into our third method for dealing with crochet ends, and that is, before we weave in the ends, we split the yarn in half. Going back to talking about ply like I was earlier, you can see that this is one strand of yarn, but it's made up of all these thinner strands, and we can pull these strands apart. So in this particular yarn that I'm using, it's a 4-ply strand, meaning it's made up of 4 smaller strands. I want to split this yarn in half, so that means I'm going to divide it up into just 2 ply sections. This can get a little tricky just because everything's so twisted and tries to get bunched up on itself. But I like to just kind of pull and then let them unwind. It can take a little bit of work and effort getting this separated. But with a little bit of patience, we can get them apart, and now the tail ends we have to weave in are much thinner than the full strand of yarn. Once I've got it separated, I will use something like the triple weave method that I showed previously, but because this is a thinner strand, when I triple it up, it's not going to be as thick as tripling up the whole thing of yarn. So I'll go ahead and triple weave this one in. Again, I'm trying to split the yarn here as much as I can, just so it's really nestled in with all those fibers. And I'll work over this section 3 times. That finishes the first half of the yarn. Now when I triple weave in the other half of the yarn, I don't want to work over the same spot because that defeats the purpose of splitting the yarn. So I'm going to go a little further up this way and run it through here. Again, once more splitting the yarn as I work on tripling it up. And this is a part where I need to mention my third little tidbit that you need to know about weaving in ends, and that is if you use this tripling up method to weave in your ends, especially if you're also splitting the yarn that you're weaving through, you need to be aware that it is near impossible to undo. Technically, it can be undone, ask me how I know, but you don't want to find yourself in that situation. So if you're going to use this method, make sure you are completely satisfied with how the project turned out, because if you discover you don't like the look of your project and you want to undo it, yeah, you're going to be in a world of hurt if you try to unravel. And now for the fourth method to deal with our tail ends is instead of weaving them into the project and hiding them, you can incorporate them into your design. I don't have any projects that I can show as a good example of this, but I'll do my best to describe it and hopefully it'll give you ideas of ways that you can turn those pesky tail ends into an actual detail of your project. So one thing I've seen people do is if they have a seam in a project where there are a bunch of tail ends, instead of weaving them all in, they'll start at the top of those tail ends and start braiding them together. And as they get further on down, they will keep adding in all the tail ends that they encounter, braiding them in, and then when they get to the bottom, they'll tie it off. And instead of having to deal with the whole seam of tail ends, they'll now have this really neat braided section that creates an extra detail and bit of interest to the project itself. Another great way that you can incorporate your tail ends into the actual design of the project is if you have a project where all your tail ends are along, say, the bottom, instead of weaving them in, you can cut them all to the same length and add a fringe to your project. I'm sure there are even more ways that people have found to incorporate their tail ends into their project's design. If this project were, say, a bag instead of a top, it could be really cute to tie my tail ends into a bow, trim these pieces, and now I'd have a cute bow detail on my project. Say it could be the outside of a bag. Honestly, it could be cute on the outside of a garment if you wanted. Those are the 4 methods for weaving in tail ends that I like to use. I also have 3 more tips and tricks for you to help with any of these methods. This next tip is to leave longer tails versus shorter tails when you cut yarn in your projects. If you leave a longer tail versus a shorter tail, it ensures you'll have enough yarn to weave back and forth multiple times. With this shorter tail here, I don't really have enough to triple it up. I also think it's just easier when weaving to use a longer tail because you have more flexibility in movement with the needle. That being said, my next tip and trick is to change up what type of needle you are using because different needles can help in different ways. Sometimes I like using a plastic needle. What I like about plastic needles is they tend to have larger eyes so they can thread more easily, and they've got a little bit of flex to them, so if my project's kind of a goofy shape, I can really work it through there very well. Another option is a metal tapestry needle. These are probably my favorite type of needle to use, and I like them because they are very strong and can punch through the fabric so easily. I have broken plastic needles in the past, but I have yet to break a metal needle. Needles also come in different shapes. So these are straight tapestry needles, these are bent tip tapestry needles, and they also make curved needles that are used for furniture and upholstery projects. A curved or bent tip needle can be great for amigurumi when you're trying to work between pieces, sew ears and things on. It can help you get into different places more easily. And a 4th type of needle that can be helpful for weaving in tail ends is a product from Susan Bates called finishing needles. These are plastic needles where the eye runs the entire length of the needle. This makes the needle easier to thread because it flexes, but what I really like about these needles is how they allow me to easily weave in shorter tail ends. Let me show you what I'm talking about. See how I can have the yarn at the very tip of the needle? That makes me have a lot more flexibility with where I can move my needle. Whereas if the eye were only at the far end of my needle, I'm limited in how much I can move this around. So when I have a really short tail like this, I can thread it onto my finishing needle, keep the yarn at the tip of the needle, which allows me to move it all over, and then I can thread it through just like I would with any of the other needles I've shown. I do think these finishing needles are a little bit pricey for what they are since they're just small pieces of plastic. That might just be because of the price it happened to be when I ordered them on Amazon, but I'll link to them down in the description because I do think they are a really neat product. And it's also worth mentioning, with all these different needle types, you do not need to have all of them. I just wanted to show you that you've got options to tackle different things. And now the sixth and final tip for weaving in your ends that I'm going to share is if you're having a hard time pulling your needle through, you can use a pair of pliers. I find this most helpful when I am working with very fine projects. So this right here, the eye's a little bit tight to get through. And just pulling with my hands, I might not have a very good grip. To help me out, I can grab my needle with a pair of pliers and pull it right on through very easily. Only use the pliers on metal tapestry needles. If you use it on the plastic, you risk breaking them, or even if they don't break, the pliers can really rough up the plastic and create spots that will snag the yarn. I hope you enjoyed hearing about how I deal with my tail ends on my crochet projects. If you've got tips and tricks that make the process easier for you, please share down in the comments. I'm always looking for ways to make my weaving and tail ends game stronger. Because like I said, it is not a task that I enjoy. I hope you have a great rest of your day. May all your crochet hooks glide easily, and happy crafting.